Welcome to The World Today. I'm Richard Nta in Nairobi. Here's what's ahead. Calls for restraint in Sudan amid protests against the military takeover. Climate talks dominate day 2 of the G20 summit. And all eyes on Glasgow, which is hosting the UN's climate change conference. Once again, welcome to The World Today. Let's begin in Sudan, where the country have denied using live ammunition during Saturday's mass protest. A doctors' union said security forces shot dead 3 people during protests that took place almost a week after the military seized control. Tens of thousands took to the streets in various cities across Sudan, including in the capital Khartoum, in the so-called March of Millions. Pro-democracy groups call for protests to demand the reinstating of the transitional government and the release of senior political figures from detention. Musa Mushin Ibrahim has more from Khartoum.
There was the day that everyone was waiting for. All thousands of people, 100,000 of people, they went to the street from many different parts in Khartoum, from the Umdurman, Bahri, and Khartoum. And it was a really enormous people. They went outside. There was the protest, and unfortunately there was the 3 killed in Umdurman and 100 injured. And there was the protest too from demonstrating from around the state, from 5 states in Sudan. They're asking for democracy and supporting the vice president Abdullah Hamdok to get back. And still, the Abdullah Hamdok sticking his condition. The strict condition is like to release all the people in the prison, and the government should be handled by him, and the army should not be put hand anything about the politics, and he wants to choose the government minister by himself. So the life is very normal, but they still cut the electricity and the internet, and they cut the cell phone and the text message, and you cannot go out from the district. You just stay at your neighborhood. Even the ambulance cannot cross the bridge or go to the hospital. And the people in Sudan still state of council, and everything is locked down, the civil obedience, and there is no any press conference, there is no any declaration from the general commander of Burhan until right now.
The 16th group of 20 leaders summit, the G20, opened on Saturday. The 2-day summit, held both online and offline under the Italian presidency, is focusing on pressing global challenges such as the pandemic, climate change, and economic recovery. Chinese President Xi attended via video link and delivered a speech. Wang Haiyang has more.
It was a call to the G20 to shoulder its due responsibilities in face of changes and a pandemic, both unseen in a century. President Xi Jinping said China is ready to work with all parties to enhance vaccine accessibility and affordability in developing countries. He said China has provided over 1.6 billion doses of vaccines for more than 100 countries and international organizations to date. That number will top 2 billion for the whole of 2021, and China is conducting joint vaccine production with 16 countries. China, together with 30 other countries, has also launched an initiative for Belt and Road Partnership on COVID-19 vaccines cooperation. Xi said that the pandemic has brought multiple crises to the world. It has hit developing countries in particular, and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is facing unprecedented challenges. He said that China welcomes the IMF's decision on the new allocation of special drawing rights, totaling $650 billion, and stands ready to lend the new allocation to low-income countries that are seriously affected by COVID-19. Xi urged major economies to adopt responsible macroeconomic policies and prevent measures taken for themselves from entailing rising inflation, exchange rate fluctuations, or mounting debts. He reaffirmed China's commitment to opening up and a fair market order.
China will stay committed to the fundamental state policy of opening up to unleash the potential of its huge market and enormous domestic demand. We will promote institutional opening up that covers rules, regulations, management, and standards, and step up protection of intellectual property rights. We will continue to foster a business environment that is based on market principles, governed by law and up to international standards, and ensure a fair and equitable market order for both domestic and foreign companies.
On climate issues, she said that China will strive to peak its CO2 emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. China will honor its words with actions and work with all countries to pursue a path of green, low carbon, and sustainable development. The president concluded with a call for joint efforts to dispel the dark clouds of the pandemic at an early date and jointly build a better future for all. Wang Haiyang, CGTN.
Voters in Japan are casting ballots for representatives for the lower house. The poll will gauge public satisfaction with the ruling coalition's response to the pandemic and other issues. It comes nearly a month after Prime Minister Fumio Kishida took power. Our correspondent Phoebe Amoroso reports from Tokyo.
Well, the voter turnout is projected to be higher than it has been recently, but then in recent elections it has dropped to a post-war low. It's expected that over 55% will turn out to vote, and that could mean that the results could be a little bit unexpected. Typically, higher voter turnout signifies that the opposition party may stand a stronger chance. The big question in these elections is currently going on. Polls are open from 7 a.m. till 8 p.m. today, so we won't expect the results till later, but the key question is whether the LDP, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, can they keep the majority. The LDP, before it dissolved Parliament, had 276 seats, but it's only set itself a target of 233 seats. And indeed, many newspapers are projecting that it could lose around 36 seats. Now, with its help of its coalition partner, Komeito, it is expected it can still maintain what's called a stable majority and still be able to pass legislation smoothly. However, it could spell trouble for Prime Minister Kishida, not really showing strong support or strong faith among the public in his leadership. However, as I mentioned, the voter turnout might be higher. This could lead to an uncertain result with more votes coming in for the opposition. And also, the opposition have unified in the voting districts, so that could stand them into a stronger chance. Really, if the LDP lose seats, it does spell a period of political instability coming up.
The Associated Press reports Yemen security forces say at least 8 people have been killed and 11 others wounded in an explosion in the port city of Aden. Saturday's explosion happened outside Aden's International Airport. A number of nearby vehicles and residential homes were destroyed. So far, no one has claimed responsibility, but local security forces blame militants of terror groups. Aden is where the internationally recognized Saudi-backed Yemeni government based itself, and it has been rocked by several explosions in the past years. Blame has fallen on local affiliates of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State groups. The Iranian-backed Houthi rebels have also targeted the city with ballistic missiles and explosive-laden drones. The 26th United Nations Conference of the Parties on Climate Change is set to open today in Glasgow, Scotland. The gathering is widely expected to be a crucial opportunity for reaching new consensus. Recent years has raised concerns about COP26's chances of success and sparked warnings that the conference may end in empty talks. Andrew Wilson reports.
The world's top negotiators, activists and journalists are about to descend on this Scottish city to thrash out once again the climate dilemma that almost all know to be real, but hardly any seem able to navigate. All the accepted science points in the same direction, but what was celebrated in Paris 6 years ago as an intention must now be turned into an agreed plan of action. But with economies reeling from the persistent pandemic and a growing energy crisis, there is little appetite for bold action. The warnings and the meetings and the reluctance to act have been consistent for decades.
We live in dangerous times, and I think it worth listening carefully to all those intelligent observers of the natural environment who are increasingly speaking with one agitated voice.
I'm not going to go to the Rio conference and make a bad deal or be a party to a bad deal. I'm not going to sign an agreement that does not protect the environment and the economy of this country.
Turbulence hitting the world's climate is no longer a matter of dispute, and crisis weather events that used to be confined to the tropics have become more common in the developed world, particularly America and Europe. Even then, the politics of agreement has stumbled.
In order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Even with the US back on board, the aspirations of $100 billion to help developing countries and binding targets for net zero emissions are proving worryingly elusive. And with energy demands still increasing, coal mines across the world that should have been closed remain open.
I think we are facing a real challenge. And in the meantime, also, this global geopolitical tension going on, and then all this trust, that is very, very important to reach global solidarity. I think that's kind of lacking.
The real cost that no one is willing to pay is the cost of inaction. The IPCC report of 2018, the IEA report of this summer, the Financial Stability Board assessment of risk, and the marketplace opportunities for profit are all coming together to drive change and to drive a different approach. But let's be clear, despite all the momentum that is heading into Glasgow, we still face a gap.
For many national governments, it's just too risky to step up. The threat of economic turbulence, the inequalities in the global financial system, the growth priorities for developing nations all conspire to create geopolitics of hesitation. The political statements are cheap. The world's scientists behind the scenes are in agreement. But for societies built on centuries of carbon energy, it's still a bitter pill. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
Well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching.
It's just taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time, it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Calls for restraint in Sudan amid protests against the military takeover. Africa lags behind coronavirus vaccination target. And all eyes on Glasgow, which is hosting the UN's Climate Change Conference. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi, and for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. The World Trade Organization tackling coronavirus vaccine supply shortage by reducing restriction exports. And in sports, we'll tell you about the para surfer champion going against the odds in South Africa. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. Great to have you along with us for this hour. Let's begin in Sudan, where the police in the country have denied using live ammunition during Saturday's mass protests. A doctors' union said security forces shot dead 3 people during protests that took place almost a week after the military seized control. Tens of thousands took to the streets in various cities across Sudan, including in the capital Khartoum, in the so-called March of Millions. Pro-democracy groups called for protests to demand the reinstating of the transitional government and the release of senior political figures from detention. And in Ethiopia, the federal government says it is still in control of the strategic town of Dessie in the Amhara region. The large town is around 300 kilometers from the capital, Addis Ababa. Rebellious Tigray forces had earlier claimed that they had seized the town, where thousands of ethnic Amharas have sought refuge. Fighting has escalated between Ethiopian government forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Much of northern Ethiopia is under a communications blackout, and access for journalists is restricted, making battlefield claims difficult to corroborate. And in Uganda, a bomb blast in a village has killed at least 2 children. The Friday explosion took place in Nakaseke district, which is 60 kilometers north of the capital, Kampala. A senior police officer there said on social media that the device was given to the kids disguised as a jackfruit toy. The bomb killed a 14-year-old and a child living with disability. No one has claimed immediate responsibility for the attack. This incident becomes the 3rd attack in the East African country in a week. Earlier, a bomb exploded at a restaurant in Kampala, killing 1 person and injuring 3 others. ISIL claimed responsibility for that attack. Police also confirmed a suicide bomb attack on a bus, which killed the suspected attacker and injured several passengers. Well, let's bring in Mohammed Dakhar, Regional Coordinator for Eastern Africa at Institute for Security Studies. He joins us via Zoom from Nairobi. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. Now, this incident is not an isolated case, as people in Uganda keep finding unexploded devices lying around in areas where the Bush War took place years ago. Why does this remain an ongoing problem is the question.
Thank you very much for having me in the studio today. You know, with the end of the Bush War, that lasted for about 6 years and ended in the 1986, Uganda continued to face a serious decades-long terrorist problem from 2 terrorist groups that operate in the region. One is the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group, and second is the Islamic State linked Allied Democratic Forces group that is actively operating in the eastern part of Democratic Republic of Congo and also Uganda. Authoritatively, the ADF, that is the Allied Democratic Forces, is the biggest group, terror group that Uganda continues to confront. And this really dictates from its formation years in the late 1980s, where it was against the presidency of Kaguta Museveni's leadership and party, the National Resistance Movement, that took power in the 1986. And with a battalion force of over 1,500 troops, the Allied Democratic Force has 2 unique attributes. One, it is both a terrorist group and also a transnational organized crime group operating in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, gold mining fields, coltan mining, the timber trade, racketeering, extortion, kidnapping. And second, actually, its head is in Uganda because of the terror financing that it receives from legal trade that are active in Uganda, real estate and the petroleum industry. This week alone, the police arrested 3 suspects who hail from Uganda.
We apologize for that breaking communication. We appear to have lost Mohammed Dakar. Hopefully, we'll get him a little later before the end of the bulletin. Let's move on down to other developing stories in Sudan. In Uganda, rather, our top story where police, in Sudan have denied using live ammunition during Saturday's mass protest. On Saturday, tens of thousands took to the streets in various cities across Sudan, including in the capital Khartoum in the so-called March of Millions. For the latest, Naba Muhaddin joins us live from Khartoum. Naba, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you for joining us. Naba, can you hear us? Naba, Sudan's military has given the British envoy Gilles Lever a deadline to leave the country after he announced support for the protests. Can you give us more details on that, Naba?
Yes, some news saying, and now it's confirmed, that the British ambassador in Khartoum was given 21 days deadline to leave Sudan after he announced his solidarity with the pro-democracy protesters, and also he called on the military generals to adhere to the power-sharing agreement signed in 2019, and he condemned the military takeover, and he named it with a takeover, and he expressed the United Kingdom solidarity with the protesters and condemning of the takeover. He also called on the military generals to go back on talks with the civilian leaders and to release the political activists and political members of political parties members that they were detained in the day of the coup. He also put the responsibility of any excessive violence against the protesters on the security forces, and he also put the responsibility of the torture. There is some news that the political detained, the political members and activists, they are tortured in the detention, so he put the responsibility on the security forces. After he published this video, just 2 days after that, he has received a warning and a deadline to leave the country in 21 days.
All right, Naba, it's a day after some of the biggest protests Sudan has seen in years. What's the mood like really over there?
The bridges are opened now, and the main streets are opened, and the downtown and the center of Khartoum is opened, but people are still fearing a sense of insecurity or any riots because the protesters escalated after the big protests. The protesters escalated the situation right now by blocking the streets again, by barricades, announcing escalatory steps, including night marches and including public strikes. So now the shops are still closed, the gas stations, the banks, hospitals. We can say life in Khartoum is paralyzed right now. There is also growing calls among professional bodies to go in a comprehensive civil disobedience, including Central Bank of Sudan is still closed, and the main institutions and governmental bodies are still closed for a week after the military takeover.
All right, Naba, you spoke of a sense of insecurity. Now, is there any sense that a return to a transitional government is in the works? From your perspective, how do you see it?
Actually, the situation is still unclear because the political parties and political activists and protest blocs are refusing any talks with the military generals. All they want is the punishment for for the excessive use of violence, the punishment of all of the crimes since 2019 military coup. They also say they don't want any compromisement or any talks with the journalists. They just want the power to be handed over to civilians. In the same time, there is internal efforts and external efforts like by international community to put them, the civilians and journalists, back on tables again. But there is a silence. Officially, there is a silence. The Prime Minister is still absent from the political scene. Only the political parties that the military took over the power from them, they are refusing any talks with the generals. So maybe the pressure of the international community, especially US and EU and other countries and international blocs, maybe the pressure will put the military and civilians on tables again. We might see a new talks and negotiations just like what happened in 2019 after the ouster of al-Bashir. But the only challenge right now is the protesters. They don't want any power sharing agreement with the generals because they said they can't guarantee the generals to take over the power again. So all they want right now is to exclude the military generals from the political scene. And also they think the parties have contributed to the sense of the turmoil. So right now the protesters want technocratic government headed by the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and the military to be in the positions of defense and interior ministries.
All right. Naba Muhaddin, thank you so much for staying on top of that story for us. Naba Muhaddin, much appreciated. Time now for a short break. You're watching Africa Live. Here's what's ahead. All eyes on Glasgow, which is hosting the UN Climate Change Conference. Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. Authorities at Uganda's Entebbe International Airport have pushed back against claims that passengers entering the country are experiencing hours-long delays over COVID-19 tests. Uganda imposed mandatory coronavirus testing for all arriving passengers. Each traveler is required to pay $30 for a test. Leon Sienge has more.
The mandatory COVID-19 testing for all incoming travelers started last week. However, some arriving passengers say they had to wait for hours or longer for their test results. 5 PCR test machines with a capacity to test 300 samples per hour have been installed at the airport. Results are supposed to be back in 2 hours. The airport authorities, however, say recent social media posts over the delays are over-exaggerating the problem.
We had a few passengers who had not filled in information online prior to coming to the airport, which caused the delay. There were also a few others who had challenges with payment, who did not want to pay. They had issues over payment, and all that created a little bit of scuffle, among other teething challenges.
At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Uganda closed its own international airport for close to 6 months. It was later reopened in October last year, and the airport has been getting steadily busier with a daily average of 1,900 passengers. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Most African countries will not hit the year-end target of fully vaccinating 40% of their people unless efforts to accelerate the pace of inoculations succeed. The World Health Organization says only 5 countries are projected to achieve this mark, with the continent struggling to meet rising demand for essential vaccination commodities like syringes. CGTN's Enoch Sokolia reports.
According to WHO Africa, only 3 countries have fully vaccinated over 40% of their population. It means only Seychelles, Mauritius, and Morocco have met the goal set in May by the World Health Assembly, the world's highest health policy setting body. The UN agency says that at the current pace, just 2 more countries, Tunisia and Cape Verde, will also hit the target. Indeed, the continent is struggling. Only 77 million people have been fully vaccinated, which is just 6% of the continent's population. In comparison, over 70% of the high-income countries have already vaccinated more than 40% of their people. But why are many African countries struggling? WHO points to several issues. The organization says countries still need to improve their readiness for COVID-19 vaccine rollout. It says 42% of countries in Africa have not yet completed district-level plans for their campaigns, while nearly 40% have not yet undertaken intra-action reviews, which are key to refining and improving their vaccination campaigns. But lack of access to vaccines is still a major problem. At the current pace, Africa still faces a 275 million shortfall of COVID-19 vaccines against the year-end target of fully vaccinating 40% of its people. WHO Africa says the COVAX facility is working to address this threat by securing deals with syringe manufacturers and through better planning to avoid deliveries outpacing the supply of syringes. Nearly 8.5 million COVID-19 cases and more than 217,000 deaths have been recorded in Africa. Enoch Sikolia, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
The 26th United Nations Conference of the Parties on Climate Change is opening today in Glasgow, Scotland. The gathering is widely expected to be a crucial opportunity for reaching new consensus on further curbing carbon emissions. The stalled progress during recent years has raised concerns about COP26's chances of success and sparked warnings that the conference may end in empty talks. Andrew Wilson reports.
The world's top negotiators, activists and journalists are about to descend on this Scottish city to thrash out once again the climate dilemma that almost all know to be real, but hardly any seem able to navigate. All the accepted science points in the same direction, but what was celebrated in Paris 6 years ago as an intention must now be turned into an agreed plan of action. But with economies reeling from the persistent pandemic and a growing energy crisis, there is little appetite for bold action. The warnings and the meetings and the reluctance to act have been consistent for decades.
We live in dangerous times, and I think it worth listening carefully to all those intelligent observers of the natural environment who are increasingly speaking with one agitated voice.
I'm not going to go to the Rio conference and make a bad deal or be a party to a bad deal. I'm not going to sign an agreement that does not protect the environment and the economy of this country.
Turbulence hitting the world's climate is no longer a matter of dispute, and crisis weather events that used to be confined to the tropics have become more common in the developed world, particularly America and Europe. Even then, the politics of agreement has stumbled.
In order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Even with the US back on board, the aspirations of $100 billion to help developing countries and binding targets for net zero emissions are proving worryingly elusive. And with energy demands still increasing, coal mines across the world that should have been closed remain open.
I think we are facing a real challenge. And in the meantime, also, this global geopolitical tension going on, and then all this trust, that is very, very important to reach global solidarity. I think that's kind of lacking.
The real cost that no one is willing to pay is the cost of inaction. The IPCC report of 2018, the IEA report of this summer, the Financial Stability Board assessment of risk, and the marketplace opportunities for profit are all coming together to drive change and to drive a different approach. But let's be clear, despite all the momentum that is heading into Glasgow, we still face a gap.
For many national governments, it's just too risky to step up. The threat of economic turbulence, the inequalities in the global financial system, the growth priorities for developing nations all conspire to create geopolitics of hesitation. The political statements are cheap. The world's scientists behind the scenes are in agreement. But for societies built on centuries of carbon energy, it's still a bitter pill. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
To South Africa now, where the city of Cape Town has begun to prepare itself for the adverse climatic conditions that climate change is expected to bring in the future. The city has implemented policy changes as well as built infrastructure to deal with challenges such as rising sea levels. Some people, however, believe climate change is already beginning to take hold on their lives and livelihoods. CGTN's Travers Andrews has more.
As a city located on the southern tip of Africa, Cape Town is often exposed to the stormy Atlantic Ocean, and this is usually the result. A broken road lies as evidence of storm surges that are increasing in frequency, and this phenomenon is only set to get worse as climate change takes hold. The city of Cape Town, though, has begun adapting to this change by implementing new policies that govern coastal development and has also invested in protective infrastructure.
We've got a range of adaptation interventions that have been completed, as well as others that are in progress. These interventions span across socio-institutional interventions, as well as the more traditional hard engineering approaches, which might include seawalls and revetments, etc.
Those interventions also include the restoration of coastal ecosystems, which play a key role in mitigating the impact of climate change-induced coastal pressures. However, researchers have found the mean rising sea level for Cape Town is 2 millimeters per year on average, which is increasing extreme tidal activity that has begun to affect some people. For many local fishermen, rising sea levels brought along by climate change presents a real danger that threatens access to key fish stocks that is a key source of income for many coastal communities.
I'm very concerned about the sea levels that is rising, because we, as small-scale fishermen, we catch from the seashore like you see here now. We throw in our nets, waiting for the fish to come to the shore for us so we can catch it. But for the recent few years, we don't see that. Things are changing. Fish don't come, or they come late.
If we catch fish, it's very small, or it's very few. And the species we are getting is not the ones we always used to get. So that make our job very difficult.
And the empty nets are further proof that some communities believe they've already been adversely affected by climate change and rising sea levels. Andrew, CGTN, Cape Town.
Time now for our business segment. Here's what's ahead. Don't go away. The World Trade Organization is tackling the coronavirus vaccine supply shortage by reducing restrictions exports. And Libya hosts its first tourist in 10 years since unrest kept visitors away.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. The World Trade Organization is tackling a vaccine supply shortage by attempting to reduce restrictions on the export of vaccines. It's also trying to get manufacturers to decentralize their production. The WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says that there are gaps in the international response to possible future pandemics from a lack of a global network and a slowness to fund solutions, particularly in poor countries. COVID-19 economic recovery and climate change are the two main issues being discussed by the leaders of the world's 20 biggest economies who are gathered in Rome before heading to Glasgow, Scotland for the UN Climate Conference.
Put in global governance, bring out the money to help finance this, especially helping poor countries. We're also saying the poor countries should spend 1% more of their GDP on strengthening their own health systems, so they too have to contribute. Now, I think we need the political will to have this adopted. If we miss this opportunity to prepare for the next pandemic, our children will not forgive us, because now we know the lessons, and we need to learn those lessons. So I'm hoping that the leaders will, have that political will to adopt some of these recommendations for the next pandemic.
Tunisia's new Minister of Tourism and Handicrafts has announced that tourism revenues went up 7% from January 1st to October 20th, 2021, compared to the same period in 2020. Authorities in Tunis say the Chinese market will be given priority in the North African country because it's one of the most promising sources of markets in the world. Adnan Shwashi reports.
Mohammed Muaz Belhassan said the number of overnight stays has increased by nearly 19%, while the number of arrivals grew 3% in October. Many countries have removed Tunisia from the red list following the improvement of the health situation in the North African nation.
There are positive indicators on the resumption of tourism activities. The traditional markets are returning to Tunisia. The British, German and Russian markets are very important. They are back after more than 18 months of absence due to travel restrictions. Now all actors in the tourism industry have a clear vision about this sector's future.
The minister declared that Tunisia aims to attract more than 100,000 Chinese tourists. The tourism department is training thousands of Tunisian tourism professionals in order to welcome travelers from China.
The Chinese market is one of the most promising and strategic markets for Tunisia's tourism industry. We are training local guides and tourism professionals who speak Chinese and know the needs of tourists from China. Chinese travelers visit Tunisia to discover its culture, heritage and civilization. They are always welcome in this country.
The tourism recovery has revived the handicraft sector in the country. This sector employs tens of thousands of craftsmen and craftswomen in Tunisia.
Tunisian craftsmen have resumed normal activity as more travelers and tourists are visiting the country's inner regions to discover and buy our items. The lockdown paralyzed this sector. Now we're optimistic.
The Tunisian government is working on the revision of the legal framework governing the tourism sector. This project aims to encourage investment dedicated to alternative tourism and to boost regional development in inner regions. Experts assert that the gradual recovery of the tourism activity after the COVID-19 crisis will help in preserving more than 400,000 direct and indirect jobs in Tunisia. Tunisian authorities adopted several economic, social and fiscal measures during the health crisis to guarantee the sustainability of the tourism industry. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
South Africa is experiencing its worst ever year for scheduled power cuts. Eskom, the state power utility, is battling supply constraints due to several breakdowns at its units in Gauteng, Mpumalanga and the Western Cape. Sumitra Naidu reports.
The latest bout of load shedding reached stage 4 this week after the national grid suffered a shortfall of over 14,000 megawatts. While South Africa has experienced stage 4 before, this is the highest amount of load shedding hours experienced in a year since the problem began in 2007.
As we stand, we are at level 4 because of the breakdown in a number of units at Eskom's generation plants. But secondly, also because of delays in the return of units that have been the subject of maintenance work that have not come back successfully.
Local government elections are set for the 1st of November 2021. There's no guarantee that there will be power on the day.
We have an underlying problem that has been with us, for many years, and it's not going to be solved by quick promises before an election. It's going to be solved by doing the right thing for a long time. Load shedding, in the meantime, is with us to stay for at least the next several years. Not continuously, but intermittently, as and when breakdowns of plant occur.
Over 800,000 matriculants began their final examinations this week. For so many in different parts of the country, the lack of electricity added to this already stressful time. But it's almost certain there is no end in sight, even with independent power producers coming on board.
The all-in cost of renewable energy, including the plant and finance, is cheaper than just the fuel cost of running a coal-fired power station. Coal needs to be decommissioned. It's reached the end of life. It's performing poorly. It's not dispatchable. It's intermittent. It breaks down. It's unpredictable. It's dirty. It's thirsty.
An emergency power procurement is underway to secure additional capacity outside of the independent power producers for renewable energy. In the meantime, power constraints are expected to continue impacting South Africa's economic recovery.
It is now urgent that all those parties that are responsible for ensuring that we utilize gas or ensure that the right amount of private investment takes place in producing more megawatts in the country must be speeded up.
Eskom has already exceeded its budget annually for diesel as an emergency reserve. The next stage of load shedding may come soon. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Libya has hosted its first group of foreign tourists in a decade with an excursion to an oasis town deep in the desert. This comes as the government revitalizes the tourism sector and changes the public image of the country among international travelers. CGTN's Penina Karibe with that story.
White buildings set amid a sea of palm trees. This is Gadame's oasis, popularly known as the Pearl of the Desert. For French traveller Jean-Paul, he's among the first group of foreign tourists to revisit the oasis following a decade-long war.
This will be the second time that we travel to Libya. The last time was over 10 years ago, so now we came with a group. There are 6 vehicles and 12 people here.
Libya had been mostly off-limits to tourists throughout the 4-decade rule of Muammar Gaddafi. Thanks to an October 2020 ceasefire and a United Nations-led peace process, the first group of tourists was able to visit on a tour paid for by the state.
They are breaking the barrier of fear among the many admirers of the Libyan desert. And now, thank God, things are going as well as we hoped, thanks to the supporters and the good people as well as the state, which deployed all its resources from the tourism and interior ministries. As you can see, the escorts that we have here, there is tight protection.
The goal of this journey is a very noble one. It is to change the idea which European tourists and citizens have of Libya, that it is a failed state and a terror zone. This is the goal, and also to show the world the truth that we, the Libyan people, are decent and peaceful.
The UNESCO-listed Oasis City has unique multi-level architecture with whitewashed covered alleyways. The tourists visited the old city as well as the newer part of town, where a mosque with striking minarets faces modern villas echoing the styles of the old town.
When I knew that there was a group of friends who almost all knew each other and who were ready to go back to Libya with Ali, we said, no question, we will sign up right away. And given the kindness and generosity he has shown and given, there was no hesitation. We will never know how to pay back what he has offered to us.
Khaled Dadera, who organized the tour, says he wants to challenge the idea that Libya is a country in decline. For travelers like Jean-Paul, he hopes this is the beginning of adventures in Libya. Penina Karibe, CGTN.
And we are not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Here's what's ahead. And in sports, we'll tell you about the para-surfing champion going against the odds in South Africa.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Africa Live. Find your voice.